Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. In my last video, Observation for Drawing Success, we looked at an observational habit so unhelpful, it almost guarantees that we can't draw anything at all accurately. So if you missed that, please go back to that video and have a look at it. But in this video, we're now going to start to look at some good observational habits, ways we can observe that will help us gather all the information, all the visual information that we need to draw well, to draw successfully. In this video, we're going to talk about and look at observing the in-between spaces. What do I mean by the in-between spaces? I mean the spaces between things. This is often called negative spacing, drawing by negative spacing. If we think of the objects themselves that we're drawing as positive things, if we think of a series of columns, for instance, then the space between the columns is really negative space. And in our culture, or in my culture, in my thinking, we tend to ignore the space between things and we see the things, the objects, as the significant thing. But if I don't learn to observe the space between the things I'm drawing, I'm at a great disadvantage in terms of gathering the information I need to draw as well as I can. And so these spaces may be things such as the spaces between columns, the spaces between windows. It may be the spaces between branches of a tree. It may be the space between eyes. It may be the space between statues. So whatever the in-between space is, it's important that we learn to look for it, to observe it, so we can use it as one of our tools when we start to draw. So as always, it's always easiest to see what we're talking about with examples. So here's 3 examples. And look, can you make sure you watch the 3rd example, because I think it's the most important example of all. Okay, let's go. Here we have the entrance to the National Gallery in London. And I'm drawing the portico, which is comprised of 8 columns supporting a shallow pediment. And in doing this, I'm not just looking at the columns and drawing them. I'm also looking at the space between the columns, what you could see as black rectangles. And I'm drawing them as a shape as well. So it's not just the columns, but it's that black box, that black rectangle between the columns. And if you like, that doubles the amount of visual information I'm seeing, I'm taking in. I'm also paying particular attention at this first stage to drawing that red banner on the left there, because that also gives me a further shape to include, which again helps me check the proportions. I've got more points of reference that I can use to make sure that all my shapes are correct, the little rectangle above and below that red banner, as well as the overall black rectangle. And then I put the second column in. So in some ways, I've tripled the visual information I have between those first 2 columns. So I use every clue I can get to try and make as accurate as I can those first 2 columns. And once I've got those in place, then it's more straightforward to go along. But again, I don't just whack columns in one after the other. I'm likely to put them too close together or too far apart. Between every column, I'm looking at that black box and I'm seeking to draw that space as an object, and then draw another column, and then draw another object, another black rectangle, and then draw another column, and so forth. And so all the way along, I'm paying careful attention to the proportions, to the spaces, to the columns, and it just helps me to be a lot more accurate. Here I am drawing the rear staircase of Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. But I'm focusing not on drawing the columns and the platform they support, but I'm looking at shapes and spaces between the shapes. So I draw the first couple of columns. And instead of rushing on to draw the second set of columns, I'm instead looking at all the lines that come between the columns and seeing each of them as a shape. The doorway, the pilasters, the gaps between the pilasters, the gaps between the pilasters and the next doorway, and then the next column, and then the gap between the columns. I'm seeing them as a series of rectangles of boxes all placed next to each other, and I take great care to get them all in place correctly. And I find that everything just falls into place rather than placing the columns first. I think this third example is the most important one because it's the least obvious one. It's something that you may not think of in terms of drawing through the between spaces. We're looking at drawing the architectural statues inside the pediment of one of the Louvre's pavilions. And in doing this, in drawing these figures, these are often troublesome details for people doing architectural drawings. And I find that when we try and draw figures in this situation, they often don't look very good, even if we can draw figures quite well normally, which isn't a strong point for me anyway. I find my figures always look awkward and squashed and out of proportion. What I found for me works much better is to really try and draw the spaces between the figures. The figures are very small anyway, and there's often good shadow cast between them. And I found that if I try and draw those dark shadowed spaces, which are often more of a wedge shape in different directions, I find what sort of happens is I'm filling in the spaces between the figures, and by the time I finish doing that, the figures kind of appear, or they almost appear, and then I just have to add one or two little extra lines to help maybe show a waist, or particularly when there's drapery, to define the drapery a little bit more. But I find I don't have to add very many lines, and suddenly I have what look like convincing figures. Don't forget, these little figures aren't the star of the show. They're usually up in the background, up in the distance. And so we don't want them to be the focal point. We just want them to look and feel right. And I find it's easier to draw the between spots, the shaded areas between them. It's easier to draw those correctly than to actually draw all these little arms and legs, because we're really just suggesting these figures so that they create the effect of a group of figures from the ground. Here it is a little bit closer, and you can just see how I really am working on the spaces between the figures, not the figures themselves. And it ends up being really quite effective, I think. What do you think? Well, I hope that was helpful. So next time you're drawing from life or from a reference, try and pay as much attention to the space in between things as the actual things that we're drawing. And sometimes it's actually easier to draw the space in between than to draw the object itself. Look, I hope it's given you something to think about, if not something to try. Okay, see you next time. Bye.